It's Ed here. Welcome to EDTalks. Thanks for listening. I know you have a lot of different choices of what you listen to or watch, and you've taken the time to be with us, and I appreciate it. Again, we are commercial-free, sponsor-free, ad-free, just pure content. So really excited today to talk to Andrew Savitz. He's the CEO and co-founder of SpirituWell. So Andrew, welcome to EDTalks.
Thank you. Good morning.
I thought this was kind of a fun topic because we talk about scale in healthcare and the need to scale in a lot of different areas. Mental health is a big one in the last couple of years, and never really talked about or heard much about the spiritual health as well, although the two, are definitely close cousins. And, to scale spiritual health, that's pretty interesting. So that sort of caught my eye. And so we'll get into, Andrew, a little bit more about who you are. We'll get into that in a second, but we got connected through mutual friends, and like I said, we're always talking about scale. We're talking about mental health, but spiritual health is, I think, probably equally important. Is very important. Let's just put it that way. And so it's really interesting what you're doing. But before we get into it, tell me about the best customer experience you've had in the last couple months, like you personally or you and your family. Any sort of experiences that stand out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. My wife and I got married within the last year and a half, and I love to cook. And so it was an opportunity, to put on our registry, knives, like really good knives, because I'm used to going into getting, budget level knives, right? And so ended up getting a gift card from a couple members of my family, which allowed me to go into Williams-Sonoma on my own and actually demo knives. And it was great. You walk in the door, and a person is there, right, to help walk you over to the knife set. It's behind, a locked glass pane. They're asking me about, my own personal, cooking habits and, what I might value in terms of trade-offs. And then brought out a board with vegetables, and I actually got to hold and feel, different knives, and really it made it a very personalized experience. That was great. And now I've got a really great knife that I use almost every day.
That's cool. Do you remember the manufacturer, what the make of the knife is?
Oh, it's Shun.
Okay, yeah. No,
Yeah.
that is a great experience, right? It was personalized. Um,
Hmm.
it was warm. You got to try it, see it, feel it, all that kind of stuff. That's a pretty good example. I know that you're sort of a transplant now to the mid to the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and I was hoping we could talk about like a great customer experience with the Minnesota Vikings, but I guess not this year. Maybe.
Well, they do a great customer experience. That's how they keep people coming back, because it isn't for their record. So I'm lucky enough to go to a game or two a season, and with the mobile app and just the ease of going in and out of the stadium, they actually do have a great customer experience. But you're going for the social interaction and the experience of the moment rather than the performance of the team, unfortunately, some of the time. But
Yeah,
there's always next year.
always next year. I've been saying that since 1975. But yeah, it is a good experience actually. I've gone a few times, being a big Vikings fan, and yeah, the with the new stadium, newer stadium, and just how they take care of their customers, and yeah, it is a good fan experience for, absolutely. What's one thing as we kind of get to know you a little bit, what's one thing that your parents forced you to do when you were a kid and you maybe had an eye roll or two, or like, I can't believe I have to do this. But now as an adult, you look back and you're like, I'm kind of glad they forced me to do it.
Hmm. I don't know if this is so much as forcing me to do something versus discouraging me from something, but it's in that spirit. My parents were always very strict about how I treated my sister, and would be very quick to, reprimand me and discourage me, fighting with her, getting in arguments, nitpicking. Um, some of the things that might be considered like typical brother sister, interaction, but I think over time, it drilled into me respect, right? And the importance of not belittling somebody who you care about. And that I think has translated well to how I approach friendships and, people I'm meeting for the first time. And I think I'm maybe overly sensitive to, being the butt end of a joke,
Yeah.
but I think that was a good lesson of,
Yeah.
what my parents discouraged, if anything.
Yeah, that's cool. And I imagine you have a pretty tight adult relationship now with your sister, partially as a result of that.
Mhm.
That's cool. So Andrew, share a little bit about yourself. We already got to know you a little bit. Share anything more that you want to share personally, professionally, that kind of led you to the point, and then we'll jump into spiritual care, but that kind of led you to where you are today.
Sure. Thank you. Um, Over the last couple of years, I've done a lot of thinking about my own, personal narrative and career journey. And I graduated from the University of Minnesota. And when I graduated, I was pre-med. I was president of the Minnesota Medical Leaders, one of several pre-med organizations on campus. And when I graduated, my mom had a letter that I had written to myself when I was, I think, about eight years old, and in it it said, I wanted to be a doctor one day. And so when you hear of people who grow up, they know what they want to be, they then did, everything to get to that point. That could have been, described as my, life going into and then graduating college. I studied nutrition at the University of Minnesota. But then when it came down to actually submitting the applications to medical school, I just had this gut feeling that I was forcing it, and it was completely on me, right? Going back to your question about parents, I had the most supportive parents, but had I wanted to be a doctor or an astronaut or a firefighter, it wouldn't have, I don't think, mattered to them. They would have supported any ambition I had. And so in thinking through that experience and then deciding not to apply, I then had to rediscover, right? Well, what do I want to do? What is the other narrative of my life? And then I started to piece together a story of entrepreneurship, and was able to look back at the art business that I started as a kid, where I actually didn't make any of the art, but my friends would make art and we try to sell it to each other's parents, right? Or, in fifth grade, I was the one every day who would go into the principal's office and get the snack cart and the money box. So that right before carpool and the bus route, I was there selling, candy and snacks for like a school fundraiser. And then I did bar and bat mitzvah montages in high school. So there was always this other narrative that was brewing in the background, and it took a lot of time for me to, in hindsight, piece together. And so 2023 was a big year. I left the world of healthcare consulting to jump into being a full-time entrepreneur in healthcare. That was something that we can, I'm sure, talk more about. But when I decided I didn't want to go to medical school, I didn't turn my back on healthcare. I knew I wanted to adapt my skills and my interests in a different way, but still to the important work of impacting people's health and wellness.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. I love the trajectory and sort of that focus, and then finding your spot. So you ended up creating, co-founding, a spiritual care oriented organization, which we'll get into SpirituWell here in a second. But why is spiritual care important in terms of whole person care? Obviously, you had to think through before you started SpirituWell. You had to think about this. So how do you
Mhm.
think about it?
Yeah, thank you. The way I think about it is, if you look at where mental health was 10, 15 years ago, and in some circles, even still today, right? Mental health was this other thing, right? People would acknowledge that it was important. They might say, oh, everybody has mental health. But when they talked about mental health, they were really thinking about mental illness, right? And so mental health as a category of both need and in healthcare, the provision of it was separate from or tangent to mainstream healthcare, right? And I think spiritual health and spiritual care um, is is coming up on the heels, right, of what that experience was with mental health a couple of years ago, where today mental health, right, and now behavioral health is the broader umbrella category, is mainstream. It's where there's a lot of innovation, a lot of investment, a lot of change in language in even pop culture, right, about accepting it as a normal thing to have mental health needs and to seek mental health care. And I don't think spiritual care is there yet, but I think it has the opportunity to be there front and center as part of behavioral health and part of what most people might consider to be an important aspect of general healthcare, both in terms of need and in the delivery of that, right? Today, depending on who I'm talking to, there's still, I think, in a belief that it's something people do in their private lives. It's something people do in their church or their synagogue or their mosque, but it isn't necessarily what's being done in all healthcare settings, right? Or if it is, it has a very specific end of life connotation, as opposed to some of the more broader, I think, opportunities and value that spiritual care and spiritual health can have on a whole person's health outlook and outcomes.
Yeah. Did you come across some research? Because I remember, but my point in time is quite a few years ago, because I'm always interested in sort of the spiritual side of life and
Sure.
how it works with just health in general. And I had seen
Mhm.
some early studies that suggested a correlation between, spiritual health and just life fullness and longevity and healing. Um,
Mhm.
and but I haven't really looked at it in several years. As you formed your company, did you come across any research like that suggested, that the importance of spiritual care in sort of that whole body mentality?
Yeah, yeah. The research is research I'm looking into every day, and including in almost every one of my introductory conversations with potential customers and people just generally out in the market. The research speaks to both the impact of spirituality and religiosity on an individual's ability to cope with a chronic illness, with a serious illness, which could be physical in nature. But physical illnesses often, right, are comorbid with depression, with anxiety, and one of the kind of root causes of potentially worsened mental health um, symptoms when somebody has a chronic or serious illness is what's referred to as existential distress. And that's experiences of lack of meaning, lack of hope, lack of control over one's life and decision making. And there's a lot of research that indicates a correlation between the extent to which somebody is religious or has spiritual practices in their regular life, how they often experience fewer symptoms associated with existential distress. And then furthermore, there are studies that have looked at the role that chaplains and other spiritual counselors can play in impacting health outcomes. And so we look at that both, broad set meta-analyses that look at, many studies. And then we also look at specific cohort studies that have looked specifically at cancer patients, for example, or patients with chronic kidney disease, for example. And it runs the gamut.
Yeah, and as you were sharing, I realized some of the latest sort of data that I ran into, was another person from Minnesota, Dan Buettner, who was recently on our Digital Voices podcast. And he's talking about, and he has got a Netflix special right now on how to live to be 100. And one of the commonalities when they did this meta-analysis across many different societies, if you had to boil it down to five things, one of those things was sort of the spiritual
Hmm.
aspect of people's lives that led to a richer, more fulfilling and longer life. So yeah, it's
Hmm.
Super interesting. All right, so let's jump into SpirituWell. So share with us your startup journey today. So because a lot of people are always interested, like because everyone has this idea, I want to start a company, and very few people do it.
Sure.
It's risky and scary. You did it. So kind of tell us about the journey to date.
Yeah. Well, my journey began with SpirituWell being just side work, right? I was consulting for another company. I was a healthcare M&A consultant, and before that, focused on technology transformation and strategy for healthcare providers, healthcare insurance companies. So I came to the idea of SpirituWell with the backbone, right, of healthcare technology business and systems. But I say I came to the idea because the idea didn't come to me. The idea came to my co-founder, who's a rabbi here in the Twin Cities. And the initial vision or inspiration, if you will, came out of COVID, right? Where individuals were dying alone, where individuals might not have been able to have contact with their family members. And, you know, as I referred to before, the place in the healthcare system where the role of chaplains is pretty well defined and commonplace is during that end of life experience. And so the other thing that happened, you know, in the wake of 2020, right, was an acknowledgement in healthcare of the importance of health equity and the importance of delivering culturally appropriate care. And so in thinking through what are the access gaps to spiritual care, you know, part of that initial vision of my co-founder was that, you know, if you're a Jewish patient, you should be able to have access to a Jewish rabbi, right? If you're a Muslim patient, you should be able to have access to a Muslim imam or other spiritual counselor with that cultural and religious background, right? And so I got involved initially just to, you know, provide, you know, my perspective, my opinion, using some of those muscles I learned in consulting, of, you know, here's how I view the market, here's how I might break up who your potential customers would be, here's what the business model could be. And then eventually, as I got more and more involved, and put my, you know, fingerprints on this idea, my co-founder and some of the other folks he was working with asked if I would want to come on as a co-founder and bring this idea to market. And after talking to my then fiance, now wife, and some mentors in my life, decided to take that leap. And so I was doing a lot of work behind the scenes, kind of in parallel to my day job, to try to get us to a good point to launch. And we did our public launch in June of 2023.
That's awesome. So I know it's only been, you know, 6 to 8 months, but are there one or two key learnings to date, you know, going through this process that, you know, things that you learned that you can share?
Yes, absolutely. One key learning would be how long it takes, but how important the work is to build a professional network of individuals who really know the space you're operating in and who are, you know, connectors to potential customers and potential thought leader partners. And even though, like I said, I've always been in healthcare, and I feel like I had a pretty solid professional network, both here in Minnesota and elsewhere, because I always worked for consulting firms that had offices throughout the country. I very quickly learned that my network was not the right network to introduce me to potential customers, to introduce me to potential thought leaders. And in hindsight, over the last 6 months, I've had to grow a lot of branches on my network. And thanks to the both generosity and time and genuine interest of folks who are at certain trade associations, right? Like membership-based organizations who represent the interests of hospice or palliative care, or of assisted living, right? Many of the post-acute points of care where now we feel like we've got the best product market fit. I can look back and now I've got a whole new group of friends and potential mentors and people who are now making introductions on my behalf that didn't exist in my life 6 months ago. And it's exciting to see kind of that as an output. But it's still short of the ultimate output, which is, finding SpirituWell's first customers and clients. And so it's been a journey, but I've learned a lot through that experience, and not taking for granted how important it is for you to build those relationships and it to not be, merely transactional.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Your last point is super important for people to learn. I mean, you're still a pretty young person and building out that network. And I run into a lot of people that are a lot older, a lot later, like mid to late career, and they still all of a sudden they're deer in the headlights, because they don't have a
Mhm.
network. And you're doing a great job, building that network. And it'll pay dividends for you and your organization long term. So I just wanted to double down sort of on what you shared, because I think it's really important. Is there anything else that you wish you would have known? Again, I know this is pretty early on, but is there
Mhm.
one thing you wish you would have known before you became a co-founder and jumped in that would have helped you, other than the network? That was a good one. But is there anything else
Mhm.
that in hindsight you're like, oh, I wish I would have taken that MBA course, or whatever it might have been?
Got it. Yeah, that's a good question. I can't think of anything that is a like technical skill per se. Some of the best advice out there is, a good leader doesn't know how to do everything, but knows how to surround themselves with people who are smarter than them in certain skills and certain areas of knowledge. So I take that to heart. If there was something I wish I knew beforehand, that I'm learning now, which to you and others might sound naive, that I didn't know this up front. It's the sales cycle in B2B healthcare is 6, 7, 10, 12, going on almost 18 months with some individuals who I know are genuine in their interest, um, but they're leading, oil tankers or aircraft carriers. And so even though they might be excited and interested and ready to move, they need to bring many, many others along. And even if all of those other folks are on board and ready to go, there has to also be a sense of urgency and timing that isn't always in my control. And coming to terms with that has been a learning opportunity for sure.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And I think one reason why healthcare, we're a little bit behind with tech, is that it's precisely what you're describing. So tell us, for those who, maybe I should have started with this when we started talking about SpirituWell, but for those who don't know, give us the 90-second like pitch. Like, what does SpirituWell do? I think it's a fantastic concept, and I wanted people to know about it.
Yeah, thank you. So SpirituWell is a virtual spiritual care provider. We are primarily a chaplain network that includes chaplains who are professional chaplains, who have clinical training and clinical experience in chaplaincy and in spiritual counseling, as members of an interdisciplinary care team. We don't hire clergy from congregational settings. It's very important that all of our chaplains are experienced and trained in the delivery of healthcare. And we are delivering our services across the care continuum. So hospitals and hospice, primarily dealing with serious illness and end-of-life situations, absolutely, but also across the post-acute care space. So selling to independent living, assisted living, and other long-term care providers, and chronic condition providers, right? And that could be single specialty chronic condition providers like oncology or chronic kidney disease specialists. Or often we're getting a lot of positive feedback and momentum with primary care providers who focus on large senior care populations, where they're actually taking risk through Medicare Advantage arrangements or through accountable care organizations. And so kind of where we are looking to do the most good and where we think there's a lot of overlap is providing our services to populations that experience chronic or serious illness, loss and grief, and loneliness or social isolation, or some combination of those, three big buckets. Because at the root of those three healthcare challenges and experiences is existential distress, is loss of meaning, loss of hope, loss of purpose, loss of control. And we believe that spiritual care and access to a chaplain for whether it's monthly visits or bi-monthly visits, whatever the cadence needs to be, has that longer term protective ability to reduce depression symptoms, reduce anxiety, and ultimately improve other physical health outcomes that are dependent on one's mental and spiritual well-being.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's very few organizations, I know mostly the hospital side, that have the staffing to provide 24/7 care, spiritual care. They're lucky if they have one person there on staff, and many have none. And so they're reliant on volunteers or, people. You just need to know your own people if you're a patient. So then you partner with those organizations and you provide that care so those individuals are in an instant. I need a rabbi, done. I need an imam, done. I need a pastor, done. Yeah, so it's instant. They get that care. It's unbiased. It's not denominationally focused, like you were saying. And so it's like immediate. It's quality, and it's I imagine for there's no cost probably to the patient. Depends how they set it up, I guess, because it's being borne by that organization. So it's providing that whole person care. So now I'm doing the mental care, I'm doing the physical care, and I've got the spiritual care. So you got the whole continuum wrapped up.
Exactly. And from a technology perspective, just like any other healthcare encounter, right? Our providers are charting that visit, are sharing that narrative of the encounter with the other members of the care team. Our goal really is to be an integrated member of the team, not just a point solution that there's a lot of friction to go find and then to communicate with. And so we're figuring out creatively, right, how to become embedded in other chronic condition management providers and other members of the care team that might be already delivering their care virtually. And as more and more of healthcare moves in that direction, I think we're well positioned to just become another tool in the toolbox.
No, I think it's fabulous. Again, that's why I wanted to have you on EDTalks and really talk about it. And we'll drop the information for SpirituWell, how to get in contact with you, your organization, in the show notes. So let me just ask you one last question, sort of a leadership question, and then we'll wrap up. Where do you go for inspiration? So when you're thinking about, could be SpirituWell, thinking about the next things, what's your source of inspiration for creativity and things like that?
Yeah, I am a huge nonfiction reader, primarily nonfiction. So at any given time, I'm reading at least one book. Sometimes I'm juggling, 2 or 3, depending on my level of interest. And from a leadership perspective, I have found biographies to be the most impactful, to learn about somebody else's leadership journey, to learn about the time period and the challenges they faced and overcame throughout their life. And I read a lot of biographies, not just of business leaders, though I do. I'm reading Steve Jobs' biography right now. But I read a lot of books or biographies of leaders outside of healthcare. Many years ago, I read a biography of Colin Powell, for example. And even though I never really had a strong association to the military, for example, learning about what his leadership journey coming up through the military before he ever got into the political or policy arena was very valuable. And there's a lot to learn about how leaders operate outside of my day-to-day context, because there's a lot of skills and lessons that then transfer, I think, well into leading teams in a business or an innovative setting.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I love the idea of the biographies, and that's great. So we talk about a lot of things, and we talked about everything from Minnesota Vikings and the customer experiences with knives, and then we talked a little bit about your journey and becoming a founder in spiritual care in general, and how that's so important to whole life health, whole body health. And then we talked about SpirituWell specifically, and what you've been doing and what it does, and where you are, and sort of ended up on leadership. Is there something we missed, or is there something that you want to double down on? I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. I think the only other thing that I would mention, as we think about maybe kind of the meta themes of healthcare and where I think SpirituWell can play a role is in that broader shift from fee-for-service care to value-based care. One of the first questions I get often is when I'm talking to prospective customers is, well, can we bill for this? I'm still getting that question. The short answer is no. But that really doesn't need to be the question if you're working in a model where providers and payers have aligned incentives to keep people healthy, right? And to proactively address their psychosocial needs, to proactively address their chronic conditions. And just like other aspects of mental health counseling and interventions from a community health worker and social workers, some of which can be billed for, some of which can't. It has value to a person's experience, and when incentives are aligned, it can have economic value in terms of cost savings. And that's a huge part of where I think we're going to align best with the future direction of healthcare. And with Medicare, CMS saying by 2030, they want, I think it's 100% of Medicare beneficiaries in some sort of accountable care arrangement, if not Medicare Advantage. The industry is going to continue to move in that direction. And I think we're part of that journey.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I always dumbfounded how short-sighted we are in some of our decision making, and we think we're saving money by not using a certain service, and it actually costs us 10x by not using it. It shows short-sighted. It's very aggravating. But yeah, I think managed care, value-based care, as we move more towards that, will help realign or align those sort of things and align the incentives. But yeah, it's still crazy to me. But that's a very good point. So Andrew, thank you. We wish you nothing but great success. I think you're definitely onto something really important here, and I love the scalability. So anyone, whether you're in a remote region of the world or in a populated region, you always have 24/7 pretty much immediate access to spiritual care. So thanks for what you're doing, and thanks for being our guest.
Thank you, Ed.
All right, that wraps up EDTalks. Thanks for watching.